The film industry has had a long and varied history, with its origins dating back as far as 1891, with Thomas Edison creating the first kinetoscope, allowing audiences to view films by looking through a small cabinet device. Other pioneers in the film industry would go on to create impressive innovations like the Lumiere brothers, Auguste and Louis, who invented the cinematograph, a more lightweight camera when compared to the kinetoscope. The Lumiere brothers would go on to have the world's first commercial film screening on December 1895 at the Grand Café in Paris. The film that they showed lasted less than a minute and showed workers leaving their factory. Soon after this, another pioneer in the film industry would emerge, as Georges Méliès would become the father of film editing. According to an article by the Britannica Encyclopedia, with a magician's intuition, he discovered and exploited the basic camera tricks: stop motion, slow motion, dissolve, fade out, superimposition, and double exposure. In 1902, Méliès released his most famous film, A Trip to the Moon, a 14-minute film depicting a group of scientists traveling to the moon, sleeping under the stars, battling aliens, and returning to Earth triumphant. The film was a combination of Méliès' editing techniques, trick photography, impressive staging, and ambitious storytelling. Another filmmaker who would expand on these techniques was Edwin S. Porter. Using his experience as a touring projectionist, Porter knew what stories and techniques worked well for audiences. As a result, he would develop his own techniques that would become some of the most influential in film history. In an article written by Paul Spear, he described Edwin S. Porter as one of the most influential American film pioneers. He is remembered primarily for his groundbreaking story films, The Life of an American Fireman and The Great Train Robbery. The techniques Porter created included parallel action or cross-cutting, as well as camera movement like panning and tilting. Another of the most influential filmmakers to emerge at this time was D.W. Griffith, who fell in love with filmmaking after acting in one of Edwin S. Porter's films. He would go on to create what we know today as the modern feature film, with the release of his most infamous film, The Birth of a Nation. In an article on the Britannica Encyclopedia talking about the film, it says, "On February 8, 1915, the infant art of motion picture was revolutionized. The film was subsequently lionized for its radical technique and condemned for its racist philosophy. Birth of a Nation paved a way for feature films to become the standard of commercial cinema, and was so financially successful that audiences demanded more films like it." The classic Hollywood period is believed to have lasted from the 1920s to the 1960s. Movie studios at the time had grown and developed in a way that allowed them to have enormous power and keep actors, directors, and other filmmakers under tight control. During this time, 5 studios dominated Hollywood. Known as the Big Five, they were Paramount, MGM, Warner Brothers, RKO Studios, and Fox Studios. They managed to gain total control in Hollywood through what is known as the studio system. This meant that everything from production to distribution was done entirely by the film studios, with them owning even the theaters that the films would be shown in a practice that is known as block booking. According to the HollywoodLexicon.com, for good reason were the studios called dream factories. They were organized and run to deliver a steady stream of product to theaters that the studios owned or partly owned. Films being made at the time all fell into specific genres, with studios specializing in certain types of films. The reason this was done was because the studios had strict control over what films got made, meaning that a lot of directors had very little creative input. Some directors, like Alfred Hitchcock, were able to work around the system and show films that were their own vision, but most were unable to do this, as the studio had total control and only made films in a certain style. In an article by RCRELetCinema.com, the classical Hollywood style follows a set of norms, paradigms, and standards that match and gratify the viewer's expectations. In other words, by the end of a classical Hollywood film, answers for all questions have been provided, and one doesn't leave the cinema perplexed and startled. These practices discourage viewers' critical inquiry of any particular film, as well as underlying practices of mainstream cinema in general. As a way to guarantee their long-term success for their films, Hollywood studios devised a way to ensure that they would have the biggest actors and stars in Hollywood appear in their films as a way to attract audiences. This was known as the star system. According to ClassicHollywoodCentral.com, the star system is the most famous part of the studio system. It was common practice between the 1920s and 1960s and is a big part of the success of classical Hollywood. This meant that actors would have to sign contracts that gave the studios total control over their life. This was done so that the actors would embody the same characters that they played on screen in their everyday life, meaning that actresses like Audrey Hepburn and Marilyn Monroe had to act like proper ladies while in public, and actors like Rock Hudson and Gene Kelly needed to act like the perfect gentleman in the same way that they would in their films. ClassicHollywoodCentral.com also states that contracts often had morality clauses in hope that it would keep actors from using drugs, committing adultery, and other indiscretions that could ruin their image. The entire goal of this system was to ensure that audiences would watch movies not because of the stories, but because of the stars in the films. The star system would continue up until the 60s, where it would begin to disappear and would be completely abolished by the 70s as actors worked to gain more independence from the studios and gain better working conditions. Throughout the 1930s to the 1950s, the audience attendance was at an all-time high as studios were producing around 800 films per year. That all started to change, however, in 1948. In an article by tvtropes.org, they state that the moment that is often considered to be the beginning of the end for the studio system and the end of Hollywood's golden age is the 1948 landmark Supreme Court decision in the case of the United States versus Paramount Pictures. During this case, the Supreme Court found that Paramount Pictures were in violation of antitrust laws, as well as other movie studios. Following this case, the Supreme Court ruled that the movie studios had to relinquish their monopolies. This meant that the studios would have to break up their organizations and would no longer have total control over the industry that they once had, and things like theaters and distributors would now have to be done by other companies. Another massive change that added to the fall of the studio system was the invention of the television. As it was more convenient for people to watch TV programs in their own homes, studios began losing large sums of money, which would add to their decline, and ensure that studios would never again have the total control that they once had, and that audience attendance in theaters would never reach the same record-breaking heights that it once did. This was the end of the Hollywood Golden Age. When looking at the history of the film industry, it's also important to look at the various significant changes in technology and the innovations that have permanently altered the film industry from their inception to the present day. One of the most significant innovations is the addition of color to film, as it has become one of the most integral aspects of filmmaking, as color provides information about scene, character, and draws attention of the audience to certain details. According to an article by Rachel Bouton for Artface.com, the birth of Technicolor in 1915 is remembered as a decisive event in the history of colored films. Founded by Herbert Kalmus, it introduced filmmakers to the two-color subtractive process, where two negatives capturing red and green lights were placed back to back. While the innovation was impressive, there was issues with the technology as it lowered the quality of images. Studios were also reluctant to use the cameras as they were so massive they created many technical issues and were not cost effective. However, this eventually changed as the Technicolor company kept on working to develop color cameras and eventually created a smaller color camera by using the subtractive color process, which allowed for far more vibrant colors while managing to get rid of technological issues. According to the Nickelodeon.com, from the 1930s to the 1950s, Technicolor was synonymous with color movies and was applauded for being more glorious than its competitors. In the 1950s, as a result of the antitrust legislation, Technicolor lost its monopoly on the Technicolor film industry, allowing other providers to offer more competitive pricing on filming and processing services. At the same time, Kodak came out with a multi-layer film stock that made it possible to use more affordable cameras and to produce higher quality images. In 1952, Kodak introduced Eastman Color, one-strip color negative process or monopack, and its high quality convinced most Hollywood studios to use it as the standard from then on. Moving forward, more movie studios adapted and developed their own systems for introducing color to film, and it went on to be the industry standard to include color in film. Another massive technological development in the film industry is the addition of sound. Sound has always been a large part of cinema, as while many people are aware of the silent era, this name is actually misleading, as none of the films at the time were ever viewed in complete silence. This meant that films would be accompanied with orchestras, piano music, singers, and even actors reading the script of the film. Many people attempted to create systems to add sound to film, like Thomas Edison and his kinetophone. However, there were two key issues, one being that it was extremely difficult to synchronize the sound with the film, another issue being the amplification, as the sound was very quiet and difficult to hear what people were saying in the recordings. This changed when Western Electric and Bell Telephone created the Vitaphone, which used a sound-on-disc system to produce quality sound. They attempted to sell the Vitaphone to studios, but most studios rejected it, until that is Warner Brothers took an interest in the technology and set up the first sound studio, and used the Vitaphone to produce films like Don Juan in 1926 and The Jazz Singer in 1927. According to NoFilmSchool.com, Warner Brothers jumped on the bandwagon early and made out like bandits. Their 1927 talkie film The Jazz Singer was a massive international success that earned $3.5 million at the box office. This ushered in a new age of sound in motion pictures. Through the financial success of The Jazz Singer, studios quickly realized that sound systems were here to stay, as films with sound did significantly better than those without. By the end of 1928, every studio had a sound system license, and by the end of 1929, 75% of all films were made with sound. As the film industry grew, there was a demand to make cinema more accessible for wider audiences, as despite the rapid growth, many people were unable to see films unless they lived near a theatre. The first electrical television was invented by Philo Farnsworth in 1927. Since then, the technology would continue to develop, and by the 1940s, televisions were made available to the public. According to History.com, during the 1940s and 1950s, that success suddenly evaporated. Movie palaces shuttered, once mighty studios closed down, and some of Hollywood's greatest actors, directors, and screenwriters stopped making films. It was the end of an era, and television was to blame. The new technology effectively killed Hollywood's golden age. As more people started to own televisions, broadcasting networks were set up to produce television shows 7 nights a week. Studios attempted to purchase interest in TV stations in 1948. However, this was the same year as the Paramount Supreme Court case, which meant that studios were unable to gain control over the networks, and TV stations were able to run themselves. Post by OriginWritings.com, according to the Warner Brothers poll in 1950, home ownership of televisions contributed to the 46 to 74% drop-off in film audience, which contributed to the decline down the path. This drop was also added to by the introduction of new leisure activities, such as sports. With television being more accessible and cheaper for people, this led to the lowest audience attendances at the movie theaters in the 1950s. Studios would then try to work to entice people back to the cinema. In the same post by OriginWriting.com, it goes on to say, "The declined number of audiences in theaters devastated the theater production groups, and reduced profits were made. They therefore launched a war against television. The new production campaigns were characterized by improved full-screen displays, scope and color. Cinerama was the widescreen. To make the widescreen a breakthrough, 3 cameras and 3 projectors and stereo sound system were required. Use of this new systems allowed audiences to feel like they were in the center of a play. Studios also stopped following strict morality codes to offer people something they couldn't see on TV. This meant that films included more adult content like swearing, nudity, and violence. By the 1960s, more than half of all American homes had television sets, and TV had irreversibly altered the studio system in a manner that took away the control that the studios once had. This meant that movie studios took fewer creative risks and invested less money into quality films. Movie theaters fell into disrepair, and fewer feature films were made, and often studios relied on sales of back catalogues of their films to be shown on television instead of their most recent features in the cinema. As long as film and television have been around, people have always been working to produce the highest definition quality image possible. According to technology.org, the earliest high-resolution experiments date back to the 1930s and 1940s. when resolution was measured in lines per screen. In the beginning, TV resolutions had used as few as 12 lines. The first high-resolution TVs used 240 lines to 819 lines, introducing a technology called progressive scanning, whereas traditional analog TV alternatively drew odd and even lines across screen to display an image. Progressive scanning displayed each line in sequence. The key moment that started the trend towards high definition was the shift from analog to digital television. This started in 1969 when a Japanese state broadcaster developed the first consumer high-definition television. In 1981, the first HD TV demonstration in the United States was held. The television had the same 5.3 aspect ratio as the Japanese system. US President Ronald Reagan witnessed the Japanese system for HD TV at a demonstration, and in response he declared the interest into the technology a matter of national interest. As a new standard had to be radically efficient, needing less bandwidth for HD TV, they needed to figure out a way to compress the digital data. To solve this, TV developers created the MPEG set of compression standards, which was based on pattern recognition technology used at NASA for cruise missile development. Since then, people have continued to develop the standards for high-definition quality in television and film, eventually leading to the creation of the H.264 or MPEG-4 system, which is used in most high-definition televisions. Public's reaction to these developments in technology have been overwhelmingly positive, as since the 1980s there has been a trend in new television resolution being revealed and an increase in the sale of televisions, with the higher resolutions as people now are able to watch films and television shows in high quality from the comfort of their own homes. Another innovation within film technology is 3D film as a way to increase the sense of immersion for the audiences watching the films. James Cameron stated in an interview with Variety magazine, "A 3D film immerses you in the scene with greatly enhanced sense of physical presence and participation. I believe that a functional MRI study of brain activity would show that more neurons are actively engaged in processing a 3D movie than the same film seen in 2D. 3D cinema experienced its first boom period in the 1950s as films like House of Wax and Dial M for Murder became popular. This was due to the growing popularity of televisions in America. Studios pushed for all kinds of new formats like 3D. They also pushed for Cinerama and Cinescope, Telecolor and VistaVision. With more time passing, 3D cinema found its biggest boom during the late 70s and mid-80s. This led to films like Friday the 13th Part 3, Jaws 3D and Amityville 3D, all being promoted with the use of 3D technology, which had become more available at the time. However, many of these films were critically panned and were disliked by audiences. As 3D technology continued to develop, some filmmakers would continue to find ways to fully utilize the technology. In 2003, James Cameron released Ghosts of the Abyss, a 3D documentary of the wreckage of the Titanic. The technology Cameron used would lay the foundation for the 3D equipment he used for Avatar. When I started down the path of developing the 3D cameras with Vance Pace in 2000, we were looking for an alternative to the massive film-based cameras I used in the past. 3D has now become more available to audiences, with cinemas and televisions being equipped for 3D, and some filmmakers like Peter Jackson and James Cameron using 3D in their films with the intention of making it more immersive for the audience. However, while this is the intent, many audiences have been vocal that they feel 3D does not add to the experience of film, and many view it as a cheap gimmick that is unnecessary. While the technology is still being developed, there are some examples of it being used to great success within film. As technology has developed, it has become more convenient for people to watch films and TV shows on their phones, computers, and other devices. This has been made possible through the increased internet speeds and bandwidth, making it possible to view videos of varying resolution qualities wherever the internet is accessible. The first known recorded broadcast to be streamed online was on the 5th of September 1995 and was done by ESPN Sports Zones, where they streamed a baseball game between the Seattle Mariners and the New York Yankees to thousands of subscribers. In 2005, the website YouTube was launched, and a year later its popularity increased, with people watching more than 1 million videos a day, including films and television. During the same time, the American television network known as ABC started streaming its most popular TV shows over the web legally. Microsoft soon launched its own smooth streaming technology in 2008, and the same year Netflix developed its own technology to power its pioneering Watch Instantly streaming service. In an article by The Hollywood Reporter, all you need today is a computer to ship your movie into almost any theatre in the country, along with a staff that knows how to oversee their operation. Amazon and Netflix don't need the trucks, they don't need field officers, they don't need prints, they need knowledgeable executives. Over the last decade, the popularity of streaming services has grown exponentially, and the technology has been developing faster to allow people to stream videos faster and faster. However, this has had a negative effect on cinemas, as more people are viewing films from home instead of going to the theatre. Hollywood has had a long history and has changed a lot since it started, and while it is different today, it still has many similarities to the old Hollywood system. As stated before, between 1930 and 1948, the 8 major studios, the Big Five and Little Three, controlled 95% of all films exhibited in the US. Things like the star system and block booking meant that studios had total control over the industry and were able to produce films at an exceptional rate, making it an average of 800 films per year. By the 1960s, this system was gone, and a massive change hit the industry, as with the studios losing control, a new generation of filmmakers were able to create more unique and influential films, which themselves were influenced by things like foreign cinema. An article in the New York Times states, "Just in the nick of time, a new movie-savvy generation of directors, influenced by European art cinema, stormed the studios and reinvigorated American cinema with their independent visions. Now," the director John Milius exulted, "power lies with the filmmakers." This marked the beginning of the new Hollywood era, with films like Bonnie and Clyde introducing audiences to the concept of sensationalism. By the mid-70s, films like Jaws and Star Wars were giving birth to the concept of the blockbuster. This new era of Hollywood saw iconic films being made by directors who had taken direct influence from foreign films. In the same article by the New York Times, it says, "Instead, foreign language cinema is often reflectively invoked as the primary influence, which partly speaks to anxieties and prejudices about know-nothing Americans learning culture from Europeans." As film has changed, it still has some similarities with the old studio system, as major players in Hollywood dominate areas of production, finance, and distribution. Stars are important to finance films, and now Hollywood use massive tentpole productions as a way to support the industry. However, there are many differences as well, as creative personnel are able to negotiate short-term deals rather than long-term contracts, meaning actors and filmmakers no longer have to work for just one studio, and allows more directors to be auteurs when making their films. As film continues to move forward, more changes are on the horizon, with the growing influence of online streaming services taking the power away from larger studios and theatres, as well as the growth of independent market, as more filmmakers find ways to produce films outside the studio system. When studying the film industry, it is always important to look at the films of other countries and see the impact and influence that they have had on the rest of the world and their films. One important example of this is French New Wave cinema. France has always been one of the most influential presences in cinema, as filmmakers like the Lumiere brothers and Georges Méliès helped to invent and shape the medium into what it is today. This influence was then expanded on in the 1950s and 60s through the creation of French New Wave. In an article by NoFilmSchool.com, the French New Wave, or Nouvelle Vague, was the French film movement that lasted from the late 50s to the late 60s, which produced such iconic filmmakers as François Truffaut, Claude Chabrol, and Jean-Luc Godard. One important aspect of French New Wave is that it is a personal type of cinema, where directors like Jean-Luc Godard and François Truffaut were able to share their life experience and philosophies. This style of filmmaking is what's known as auteur theory, a concept that acknowledges film as a product of the director's absolute imaginative and aesthetic vision. In a quote by Jean-Luc Godard, he stated, "Photography is truth. Cinema is truth 24 times per second." This was the philosophy for Jean-Luc Godard and his fellow filmmakers known as the Young Turks. Their goal was to capture life in France during the 50s and 60s and present that life in a cinema. In another article by theculturetrip.com, with an emphasis on invigorating cinematic narrative, French New Wave cinema rejected traditional linear tropes of storytelling and created a new language of film. The Young Turks felt that they could not use the already established techniques of cinema, as they felt that they were outdated and were not reflective of their life experiences. As a result, they set out to create an alternative to the styles and techniques that were most commonly being used in Hollywood and other filmmakers at the time. This was so that they could create techniques that would substitute the already existing methods for making film. They were determined to go in the face of what was considered conventional cinema. In another quote by Jean-Luc Godard, he stated, "A story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order." One of the key noticeable features in French New Wave films is the editing, specifically its use of jump cuts. In films like Breathless and The 400 Blows, the jump cuts are extremely noticeable within the films, especially when compared to other films being produced at the time. This was because most people thought of editing as something that had to go unnoticed in conventional films, and saw it as nothing more than a tool to tell the story in a linear manner. In an article by Britannica.com, an example occurs in Godard's Breathless, in which scenes change in rapid pace to create a jerky and disconnected effect. The reason for this was to make the audience aware that they were not watching a film, and demystify the audience as it didn't follow the rules of editing that Hollywood had established. This technique would inspire future filmmakers to develop what we know now as the modern montage. Another part of their editing involved cutting out parts of the film that didn't add to the scene, and it's through this that movies' paces have increased significantly. Another noticeable aspect of French New Wave was the long take. The long take within French New Wave was developed as each director associated with the French New Wave liked to keep their cameras in a state of motion within certain scenes. This meant that just because a character was walking out of the room, the camera would follow them, and this would then change the idea of space and setting for the audience as they watched, and made the film feel less closed off as a result. This would mean that the camera would move in an unconventional manner as a way to emphasize certain scenes. An argument can be made that the reason for this was due to the lack of budget within these films, but it became a staple of French New Wave cinema, and is still used by directors today like Quentin Tarantino. The French New Wave is one of the most influential cinema movements, as directors involved chose to break away from conventions, and as such made some of the most unique films completely in their own style that many filmmakers are being inspired by and paying homage to today. Mexico is another country with an interesting style of cinema, which has also been influenced in creating more films using unique styles and techniques. When looking at Mexican cinema, there are three key moments: pre-1930s cinema, the Golden Age, which took place between 1934 to the mid-1950s, and a new Mexican cinema which started in the 1990s and is still going to the present day. Film in its early days were very popular in Mexico, with the silent film industry in Mexico producing several movies, and Salvador Toscano becoming Mexico's first filmmaker. Many films in the early 1930s were political propaganda in the early 19th century, which depicted large battles during the Mexican Revolution. The cinema experienced significant changes within this period, such as further establishment of censorship and a swift away from documentary films to entertainment films. By 1924, very few narrative films were being produced in Mexico as a result of government spending cuts. This meant that very few films were being produced, as a result of the unsettling political climate and a surge of popularity in Hollywood and American films. This began to change in the 1930s, as Mexico became more established as a film industry and started to create some of the world's most colourful and diverse films. This was seen as the beginning of what is known as the Mexican Golden Age. According to BFI.org, during the middle decades of the last century, Mexico became a powerhouse for film production in Latin America, giving rise to a generation of fabulously talented directors and stars. During this time, Mexico had a wide range of comparable film production and genres, and had a number of master filmmakers working. In an article by theculturetrip.com, the themes explored by Mexican cinema industry could afford to be more wide-ranging and interesting, thereby stealing the attention of a captive Spanish-speaking audience who wanted films exploring different themes. Actors from the Mexican Golden Age were also important figures, and unlike stars in the Hollywood system, were able to appear in films ranging from wide different types of genres. In the same article by culttrip.com, they state, these actors all reached cult legend status during the Mexican Golden Age, because unlike Hollywood, stars were unlikely to be tied to one production company and could therefore take on a wide variety of roles in several genres. At the height of its popularity, the Mexican Golden Age of cinema found its commercial strength within Spanish-speaking markets in Central and South America and delivered several box office successes in the US. During the 1930s, Mexico became a refuge for European exiles. This meant that many European filmmakers go to Mexico to add their own new ideas to their films and increase the creative atmosphere within the Mexican cinema industry. Unfortunately, by the late 1950s, the Mexican film industry had stagnated. Unionization prevented new talent from entering the industry, and films being produced towards the end of the 50s were seen as tired and formulaic by audiences. The end of the Mexican Golden Age came after the death of one of their biggest actors, Pedro Infante, in 1957. A year later, very few films were being made in Mexico. In an article by Madeline Herbig, they weren't reinstated until 1972, and it wasn't until the early 90s that Mexican film was revitalized. The most famous Mexican film directors today are Alfonso Cuarón, Guillermo del Toro, and Alejandro González Iñárritu. All three directors are well known and respected, earning awards and critical acclaim for their work. However, despite their success, the Mexican film industry still does not have the same recognition it once had. The reason for this being filmmakers in Mexico are not as supported as they once were, with audiences not being interested in most Mexican films. That said, Mexican cinema has left an interesting impact on the state of film and has inspired other filmmakers throughout the world with their cinematic language. When looking at the film industry, there are many different countries with their own unique styles which have influenced the film industry in a number of different ways. One country that has been very influential is Japan. Home of legendary directors like Akira Kurosawa, Japan has produced some of the most famous films like Seven Samurai, Rashomon, and Godzilla. Directors like Quentin Tarantino and George Lucas have stated publicly that they have taken a large amount of influence from Japanese cinema in their storytelling. Finland is another country with an interesting filmmaking history, with the first feature film in Finland, Anna-Lisa, being released in 1922. The film itself was considered boring and was critically panned. The following years were difficult for the Finnish film industry as they struggled to compete with films being produced by Soviet Russia. Eventually, in the 1970s, Finland would be able to gain new recognition as new filmmakers like Risto Java developed films that took on social realism. In the 1980s, an even more modern, refined and refurbished style of cinema was produced in Finland thanks to films like The Liar. Finland cinema continues to produce some breathtaking yet small-budget films. One of the most significant film industries today is Korea, as it has been experiencing a renaissance that has started in the late 1990s and has been continuing on to this day. This started blooming with their domestic movies overtaking Hollywood movies in Korea. Due to having few restrictions, films released in Korea are extremely varied, from action to blockbusters to dramatic independence. The industry in Korea has been growing at such a rapid pace to the point where in 2020, Bong Joon-ho won the Oscar for the Best Picture for his film Parasite. South Africa is another country that has produced some of the most interesting films in recent history. One South African film to achieve international acclaim was The God Must Be Crazy in 1980. This is about how life in a traditional community of Bushmen is changed when a Coke bottle thrown out of an aeroplane suddenly lands from the sky. Another high-profile film portraying South Africa in recent years was District 9. Directed by Neil Bolkamp, a native South African, and produced by Peter Jackson, the action science fiction film used its alien characters as a metaphor for the apartheid in South Africa. The film was a critical and commercial success worldwide and was nominated for Best Picture at the 82nd Academy Awards. From 2009 onwards, the film industry in South Africa continued to increase as Hollywood studios continued to use South Africa as a location for a number of blockbuster films. The Netherlands is another country with an interesting film history in film production. Due to the Netherlands' great success with their documentary production since 1988, the International Documentary Film Festival has been religiously held in the Netherlands' capital city Amsterdam. This in itself was accepted as a huge reward for all the work Dutch filmmakers had been putting in since their liberation. Iranian cinema has also had an intriguing changes within their film industry as well very recently. Following the Iranian-Iraq War, which began on the 22nd of September in 1980, films being produced were used as propaganda against Iraq and the USA who fought alongside them. Another massive change to the Iranian film industry came in 1988 when the government started funding ethnic cinema, meaning that more filmmakers were being provided with more funding opportunities within the country. By looking at the film industries of other countries, it helps to gain a wider perspective of the film industry as a whole and helps to influence filmmakers to create new and exciting projects and change the way people think about their approach to film. When looking into the film industry, it is also important to look at independent cinema, as it plays an important role in the film industry as it allows directors and filmmakers to express themselves more freely without the constraints of the studio system. In an article by Elliot Grove, he says, Hollywood has created this crazy situation where businessmen basically create the majority of films as a way to realize their multi-million-dollar business deals. So much so that any film made outside this nutty, dizzy factory has to call itself an independent film in order to be distinguished from the suits. Independent cinema refers to any film production created outside the major film studio system. This often means that they are made on lower budgets when compared to Hollywood films and are produced and distributed by independent entertainment companies. When talking about independent cinema, Michael Winterbottom said, "I think from the point of view of making films, I just want to make the films I want to make. In a sense, that is the best definition of independent. People making the films they want to make, rather than working within the studio system and making a film for the studio." The concept of independent filmmaking is not something that is new to the industry. In 1908, the Edison Trust held a monopoly on film production and distribution, which was comprised of the major studios at the time, and any filmmakers who declined to join or work with them were considered independent. Even during the studio system era, there were studios like Grand National, Republic Pictures, Monogram Pictures, and PRC, who existed independently of the major studios but still utilized some of their business practices. Another example of an independent studio from the time was United Artists, as it was formed by artists who were seeking independence from the studios. This included Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith. Unfortunately, United Artists struggled to keep up with their larger studios, and despite various production partners including Disney and Goldwyn, United Artists shut down in the 1940s. After the studio system's collapse, filmmakers in the 1960s experienced more freedom at the time. However, even though the filmmakers may have been independent from the studios, many of their films were studio funded. During the 90s, independent films managed to create a huge boom in the industry thanks to the help of film festival circuits. This is when directors like Quentin Tarantino were able to gain attention in the industry. Hollywood studios also decided to get involved by taking over small independent studios and started planning to take over the independent market. These days, filmmakers have a lot more options to allow them to get their films funded and be independent. Through practices like crowdfunding, government funding, and finding small private investors, filmmakers are able to earn the money needed to produce films without going to the major studios. The development of film technology has also helped the indie filmmakers, as cameras and other pieces of equipment are more affordable and easier to use for film productions. One part of the world which has been one of the biggest parts of independent cinema is the UK. Part of the reason for this is the Enterprise Investment Scheme, film tax relief, and public funding from groups like the BFI, BBC, and Channel 4. This has made it easier for British filmmakers to gain their funding. In a study packed by Ulsberg SPI, it states, "Independent production has not experienced as strong a growth trajectory as US studio production in the UK. While UK's independent producers operate in an increasingly strained landscape, the extent of these challenges and their impacts on the sector are obscured to a degree by the huge success being attained by other areas of the UK's production landscape. Unfortunately, the market for UK film has been on the decline since 2007 and has gone down at least 50%. However, despite this struggle, there is still an appetite in the market for low-budget indie films as well as high-budget blockbusters. An example of this is when in 2014, Whiplash became one of the most popular indie films, earning multiple awards and high praise from critics. When looking into the film industry, it's interesting to look into the various narrative structures that are used by different parts of the industry when making the films themselves. One of the most common and well-known narrative structure is the Hollywood narrative system. The narrative system used by Hollywood is more focused on stories themselves, often following a very linear path of establishing the main characters, explaining the problem, and then traveling towards a resolution at the end of the film. The grounds for this narrative style were developed during the early days of Hollywood, at the start of its golden age, with many films being produced in a way that each genre would follow a clear narrative format and structure. According to an article by rjctarielacinema.com, the classical Hollywood style has elements and is formulaic. In terms of narrative, the classical Hollywood style generally provides a comprehensive resolution in the end. In editing, it is most influential in continuity of editing. In cinematic space and time, it is unified, continuous, and linear. This style was started as part of the studio system, and its goal was to produce as many movies as possible with the aim of selling them to as wide of an audience as possible. This meant that studios were less willing to produce more experimental films, and that many films from this period followed a strict narrative structure. This would continue up until the 60s and 70s. While many films still used a similar narrative structure, there was an increase in more experimental films by filmmakers who had been inspired by the films from other countries to create more unique narrative styles. Nowadays, many Hollywood films that are produced still use a narrative style that involve a linear pattern. However, there are also films being produced that follow a more experimental format. Many of these films use their narrative as a way to explore more character-based storytelling. The most common form of narrative being produced by Hollywood studios are still films that follow this linear pattern and are done with the same intention by the studios to sell the film to as many audiences as possible. However, occasionally films with more unique and experimental narratives are produced with the intention of pulling in a large audience with the more unique storytelling. European cinema, often referred to by people as art cinema, has always been an important part of the film industry, and as it has developed separate from Hollywood through the early years of the film industry, it has managed to create and innovate its own unique cinematic languages with different European countries like France and Russia. According to Encyclopedia.com, the filmmakers implied by the term are such European auteurs as Massimiliano Antoni, Federico Fellini, Jean-Luc Godard, and Ingmar Bergman. The films include La Aventura, 8½, Breathless, and The Seventh Seal. The cinemas are small film theatres rather than picture palaces of old, or the multiplexes of the present, screening new films but having a repertory function as well. The audiences for the art film are drawn from the highly educated urban intelligentsia. As stated before, the influence of French cinema on the rest of the world is extremely significant as filmmakers continue to pay homage to films like Breathless and other influential films from the French New Wave movement. The influence of Russian cinema also have influenced filmmakers in a way to allow them to put more emphasis on symbolism when composing their stories, and are techniques that are used heavily by auteur filmmakers as ways to make their films more unique and impactful to their audiences. According to OxfordBibliographies.com, the primary debates in art cinema scholarship revolve around the aesthetic and ideological implications of art auteurism, ambiguity, reflectivity, genre revision, and psychological realism. Some scholars contend that these characteristics have merely enabled art films to be marketed as niche commodities in the capitalist film markets, while others believe that art films pose significant challenges to the foundations of mainstream cinema. When looking at the different narrative styles from other film industries, non-Western or Asian cinema often have the most unique narrative techniques. In many films released by countries like Japan, China, and Korea, many use unique narrative techniques that focus not just on a character's journey, but also on a broader significance in the meaning of their actions and often convey an important message within their narrative towards the audience. According to an article by themillions.com, introduction and development are comparable through only slightly to exposition and rising action, and conclusion to denouncement. There's not a climax that determines the character's fate, one way or the other in this setup. In fact, the present story in many East Asian narrative remains largely unaffected by the turbulent emotions rolling inside the characters. This aspect of Asian cinema has been extremely influential, as filmmakers like George Lucas and Quentin Tarantino have taken direct influence from these types of films and their narrative styles and techniques. As it is clear, non-Western cinema is one of the most unique forms of cinema narration and is extremely influential on Western filmmakers as they continue to take inspiration from these films and their narrative styles. Another extremely interesting area of the film industry which is known for intriguing narrative is alternative cinema. One such narrative structure is the Aristotelian narrative structure and Todorov's narrative structure. According to SSSFCmediastudies.com, the concept of unity guides nearly all of Aristotle's proclamations about narrative structure. He explains that you can test the unity of a work by removing a part or reordering parts. If the plot's meaning and sense survive, the work is not unified. It has superfluous parts. In a good plot, every occurrence results from the previous occurrence. Every portion is crucial to the plot's development. Incompleteness is no better than excess, but if a plot has a beginning, middle, and end, it is whole. This sounds like a relatively low standard, but Aristotle has specific definitions of beginning and end. They must be at opposite ends of the cause and effect chain that form the substance of the play. A beginning has no determining cause, an ending has no effect. These forms of alternative narration have been prevalent throughout the art of storytelling, with only a few films exploring the possibility of these narrative theories, with there being few noticeable accounts of them being used. In the same article, it goes on to describe Todorov's narrative structure. Todorov's theory is that in a film or story, the power is in a state of equilibrium. He believes that as the story progresses, the state of equilibrium can change, giving one person more power or authority over another throughout the plot, keeping the audience entertained. Each story should start with an initial status quo or power setter of a person within a group. This person or group has authority over others. However, the equilibrium is changed after a disruption resulting in disequilibrium. The old equilibrium is broken and therefore a new one must begin. This will repeat during the narrative until we reach the final equilibrium. By using these alternative narrative techniques, filmmakers are able to experiment and create more unique viewing experiences for audiences, as these techniques are often most commonly used by art house and auteur directors and filmmakers. Another important narrative style in cinema comes from the New Wave cinema that gained attention in the 60s and 70s, and is most commonly associated with the French New Wave movement. However, countries like America and Britain have their own forms of New Wave cinema that used narrative styles to focus stories less on large adventures and events and more on dramas with individuals within the lower classes of society, telling specific stories with the aim of reflecting life from these parts of society, just like the French New Wave. According to an article in Medium.com, the New Wave cinema is a term coined by critics of French filmmakers in the 1950s and 1960s. It was a movement influenced by Italian realist cinema and classical Hollywood cinema, who, Although never a formally official gathering, they all had one thing in common. They believed the tradition needed to be undermined in order to create a new contemporary. As previously stated, the influence of French New Wave is still being felt as many filmmakers continue to pay homage to it. British New Wave is also another aspect of the New Wave movement, as it focuses on telling stories that often reflect the lower classes of society, which often goes against the other countries' preconceived notions of life within the UK. In the same article by Medium.com, it goes on to say, the British New Wave, also known as kitchen sink dramas, filled the gap between the stiff upper lip cinema of the 1950s and the swinging 60s which followed. It was the first time that the ordinary people live in ordinary two-up, two-down houses, speaking in local accents, and had an opportunity to see their lives reflected on the big screen. The narrative styles of New Wave cinema are still being used today within independent cinema, and are continually being developed by filmmakers using more experimental narrative techniques. Non-linear narrative is a narrative style that is seen in many different film industries, more commonly used in indie films like Pulp Fiction and Memento. However, there are a few Hollywood films that use this as a narrative style. According to NoFilmSchool.com, this is a narrative technique where events are portrayed out of chronological order, or the logical order presented in the story. The pattern of events needs to jump around and not follow a linear pattern. A non-linear narrative can also be known as a disjointed narrative or disrupted media. This technique is often used by auteur filmmakers as a way to engage the audience more, in a unique way, and to make them wonder more about the structure of the story, as it requires them to pay attention in order to properly piece together the order of the narrative. In the same article by NoFilmSchool.com, it goes on to say, one of the most famous movies of all time, The Godfather Part 2, uses this form. We begin the movie seeing Vito immigrating, but we jump back to Michael's storyline and then back to Vito as he grows up and becomes the Godfather. The movie bends time to its advantage, creating a sprawling father and son tale juxtaposed against one another. When looking at all these aspects of the film industry, it's always important to take a look at a case study to see the impacts that the various techniques and styles have on filmmakers, and see how auteur filmmakers with different styles put into practice the different techniques to create their own unique style. For this example, I will be looking at the films Django Unchained, released in 2012 by Quentin Tarantino, and the film Jojo Rabbit, released in 2019 by Taika Waititi. The definition of auteur theory in regards to filmmaking is when a director has such a recognizable style in the films he or she creates that it is clear to the audience that they were involved in every stage of the filmmaking process, and thus making the film their own unique product, filmed in their unique style. According to IndieFilmHustle.com, auteur theory is a way of looking at films that state that the director is the author of the film. The auteur argues that a film is a reflection of the director's artistic vision, so a movie directed by a given filmmaker will have recognizable, reoccurring themes and visual cues that inform the audience who the director is, and shows a consistent and artistic identity throughout that director's filmography. One filmmaker who is the biggest example of this is Quentin Tarantino, most well known for combining techniques that are most commonly found in French New Wave and Japanese cinema. Many of his films are known for being highly stylized, with a large focus on revenge, intense graphic violence, bizarreness, and witty characters, all of which can be found in the film Django Unchained. In a post by lefate.edu, when considering the merit of the auteur theory, it is important to consider a concrete example that supports the concept, namely Quentin Tarantino. Throughout his career, Tarantino has had complete control over films and is heavily involved in every aspect of filmmaking. As his aesthetics, Tarantino has a unique stylistic tone that cannot be easily matched. Known for long, intense dialogue, humorously dramatic violence, and frequently non-linear scripts, Tarantino undoubtedly has a signature mark. A well-known common theme throughout his films is the revenge plot, exemplified in films such as Kill Bill, Inglourious Basterds, and Django Unchained, among others. Taika Waititi is a filmmaker who has gained more popularity in recent years, with films like What We Do in the Shadows and The Hunt for the Wilder People. He is most well known for his combination of comedy and drama in his films, using the humor as a way to highlight key dramatic elements within his story. He often uses rather bizarre and dark humor within his films while also looking at themes of dealing with life and important relationships. While some people do debate whether or not Taika Waititi can be considered an auteur, the majority do seem to support him by stating that he has a unique style to each of his films, being highly involved throughout the process and telling stories from his own unique perspective. In an article by Medium.com, his films, Boy and Hunt for the Wilder People, particularly fall into a category of comedy drama or dramedy. Dramedies combine elements of drama and comedy in a way that provide lightness without mockery and understanding without sentimentalism. Waititi specifically focuses on people on the margins of society and uses father-son relationships to balance the delicate nature of the genre, the success of which has proven his status as a new auteur in this golden age of dramedy. These aspects of Waititi's work can clearly be seen in Jojo Rabbit, as it is a unique comedy drama. Simply put, genre theory is the act of placing films within specific genres based on their characteristics. In the case of Django Unchained, it falls under the Western genre as the film is set in the American South, and like most of Tarantino films, it is also a revenge film, as it tells the story of Django being freed from slavery and then gaining revenge on the men who enslaved him, and then later in the film's climax sees him taking revenge on the people responsible for enslaving and tormenting his wife. In an article by canlitguides.ca, as readers, we often think of genre in terms of writing styles: comedy, romance, mystery, drama, and tragedy. We are trained to recognize the conventions and hallmarks of these forms. Genre also includes a broad categories like poetry, novels, and plays. In regards to the film Jojo Rabbit, it falls under the genre of a World War II film. However, it defies the expectations that most people would have for this film in the genre by also being a comedy as opposed to a more dramatic films that are more common within this genre. The film is also regarded as a coming-of-age story, as it focuses on a small boy growing up in Nazi Germany and is coming to realize the truth behind the Nazi Party and their evil beliefs. Feminist film theory is when a film goes against what is considered the stereotypical view of what a woman is meant to be. According to OnlineLibrary.com, feminist film theory criticizes classical cinema for its stereotyped representation of women. Its aim is to adequately represent female subjectivity and female desire on the silver screen. During its heyday in the 1970s and 1980s, a post-structuralist perspective domineered the approach to cinema, claiming that cinema is more than just a reflection of social relations, in that it actively constructs meaning of sexual difference and sexuality. Quentin Tarantino has often made films that go with this theory, like Kill Bill and Jackie Brown, which mainly involve women not only taking the lead role, but pursuing roles that go against what is considered the norm for the stereotyped women, with them performing acts of graphic violence, which is most commonly associated with men within cinema. However, that is not the case within Django Unchained, as while there are some female characters within the film, they are not as prevalent throughout the film. Even Django's wife, who is a driving force for the film's plot, does not receive a large amount of screen time, and the only other female character who does receive the most amount of screen time is Calvin Candy's sister, whose presence and even death in the film is used only for comedic effect. This is where Jojo Rabbit is greatly different, as Scarlett Johansson's character, Rosie, is an integral part of the film, and while she does portray the role of a mother and housewife, she is an important part of the plot, as it is her actions to save Elsa and keep her safe, as well as act as a secret member of the German resistance against the Nazis that is more in line with feminist theory, as the film does not just portray her as a mother, but also as a person who cares deeply about others and is determined to act against the injustices which she has witnessed in any way she can. Another aspect of that is in the case of the character of Elsa, who, while having to hide from the Nazis, is still defiant, as her aggressive attitude within the film and her general demeanor are not completely within what people would regard as a stereotypical portrait of a girl in a World War II film. Finally, there is Rebel Wilson's character, Fraulein Rahm, who is the one who goes the most against the stereotypical idea of a woman in cinema, as she is depicted as one of the most humorous characters within the film, often partaking in the more comedic scenes in the film, and during the film's climax, she can be seen in the scene going into battle with other German soldiers using an extremely large machine gun, which is often something done by men within cinema. When analysing film, another important aspect is semiotics, where looking into the various signs and behaviour of characters in the film show the importance of the message. In an article by Britannica.com, semiotics, also called semiology, the study of signs and sign-using behavior. It was defined by one of its founders, the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, as the study of the life of signs within society. This is key when it comes to films like Django Unchained and Jojo Rabbit, as both use semiotics as a way to convey key moments and messages within their film stories. In the case of Django Unchained, it often uses symbolism in its violence. This is shown in key moments in the film where men who are slave owners are killed, and their blood can be seen splattering on white cotton fields and a white horse. This is a representation of the innocent lives these slave drivers have destroyed, and this act of revenge on them is justified by the blood that is on their hands and others like them. Another key moment of this use of violence as symbolism is in how, in many of the scenes depicting the white slavers being killed, it is almost glorified and even seen as justified every time it happens. As opposed to any scenes that involve a black person being hurt or killed, the violence is shown in a more realistic manner and creates more sympathy for the person being killed within the scene. In Jojo Rabbit, symbolism is used frequently throughout the film, as well as a way to highlight key moments in the narrative. Early in the film, there is a scene where the camera is focused on Rosie's red shoes, as a way to highlight her lovely and colourful nature and her warm glow in Jojo's life. The shoes are then used again later in the film, when Jojo finds Rosie has been hung as a traitor by the German soldiers, as the frame once again focuses on her shoes as a way to identify her. The colour of the shoes has also drained in the scene, exemplifying the fact that her life has been lost. Another important use of semiotics in the film is the book about Elsa and the Jews that Jojo is writing, as he uses it as a supposed guide to Jewish people. As Elsa keeps telling Jojo obvious lies that he only believes as a naive child, it is not brought into that much attention. When the book is once again brought back into focus when the SS officers enter the house and read from the book, gaining enjoyment from it, it acts as a symbolism, showing that people who believe in the Nazi propaganda and their hateful message are no more intelligent than an ignorant child, and that they show them as unintelligent. In an article by ScienceSalad.com, semiotics is a key tool to ensure that the intended meaning, for instance, a piece of communication or new product, are unambiguously understood by the person on the receiving end. Usually there are good reasons if someone doesn't understand the real intention of a message, and semiotics can help unravel that confusion, ensuring clarity of meaning. Another important part of any film narrative is representation, as films are able to represent the views and ideas of different people from different cultures and even different time periods. This is another aspect that both Django Unchained and Jojo Rabbit do very well. In an article by Medium.com, it says, "The content our society views on screen is supposed to reflect its people, but all too often the entertainment and media industries tend to marginalize people of color and women, just to name a few. Stories affect all areas of life in terms of how people view themselves, how they live their lives, and how they see others. Some of the content that these industries distribute to the public remains the only form of representation some individuals see, and these portrayals may be accurate or inaccurate." In the case of Django Unchained, it sets out to act as a form of representation for black people and represents the people who lived during the times of slavery in America. The entire film is geared towards a revenge fantasy that aims to empower black people. Throughout the film, the majority of the black characters are depicted as being more intelligent than the white characters. Even with the villains, Samuel L. Jackson's character is set up as the bigger threat among the film's antagonists, as he is the only one to figure out that Django and Dr. Schultz are lying. And the slavers of the film are depicted as not only being ignorant and unintelligent, but also as being determined to make themselves appear superior to other people. This is best shown in the characters of Big Daddy and Calvin Candy. In Big Daddy's case, he makes a point about Django not being allowed to ride a horse in front of his slaves, but immediately changes his attitude once Dr. Schultz makes an offer of money, showing his facade. And in the case of Calvin Candy, he also puts up a facade of sophistication, pretending to be an intellectual, when in reality he's nothing more than an ignorant and cruel man. In the case of Jojo Rabbit, there are two groups that are being represented in the film. One group that is being represented is Jewish people in the form of Elsa, and how her predicament as a Jewish girl being hidden in an attic is meant to make her act as a representation of Jewish people being persecuted and having their lives destroyed by the Nazi Party at the time of World War II. This is most noticeable in her attitude, as she is seen in multiple scenes having quiet moments where she feels pain and despair due to her circumstances and the way in which she reflects on her former boyfriend Nathan as an example of the pain of the life that she has now lost. She also shows defiance in her attitude, as she often appears strong and aggressive towards Jojo when talking about the Nazi Party. She simply describes it as being stupid, showing that even though she is in a bad situation, she is still defiant against the group that is attacking her and her people. Another group that is being represented in the film is also a group of people that is often does not receive a large amount of attention in most Western cinema. That being the people living in Germany during the war. They are being represented by the characters of Jojo and Rosie, as Jojo represents a child living in Germany at the time, but also is a representation of someone who is becoming disillusioned with the fascist ideals of the Nazi Party, and by having Jojo shouting angry pro-Nazi statements during scenes, it depicts him and the ideals of that group as ignorant and even childish. But as Jojo matures in the film, he sees the party for the evil that it is, showing that he is growing, and though his interactions with other characters show the pain and hardships that the people in Germany were facing at the time, not just the groups of people that were being persecuted by the Nazis. Rosie is also a representation of people in Germany who did not agree with the Nazi Party ideals, and as a part of the German resistance, shows the risk that people like her took during this time. She also acts as a representation of a woman during this time, as her natural fears and concerns for her child, and also wanting to keep Elsa safe at the same time, are shown throughout the film. Media depicts stereotypical representations for people of color and women, whether through Hollywood or on the news, as violent criminals, the help, terrorists, submissive characters, highly sexualized beings, unintelligent people, and more. Similarly, there are concerns for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer populations and depictions of disabled persons. Seeing oneself on screen is crucial because society is not monolithic, multifaceted. These films both provide the attitude with a balanced look at different groups of people at different times, and both seek to show the flaws and toxic thinking of evil groups of individuals that also represent the people whose lives were most affected by these times and give a positive representation towards other certain groups. As the film industry continues to move on and develop, there are many new challenges that have developed as factors from both within and outside the film industry, leading to larger changes within the medium. One such issue that has highly impacted the film industry as well as many other industries around the world is the recent pandemic with the spread of coronavirus. As the world has entered into a massive lockdown, many cinemas have been shut due to fear of public safety, and many movie productions have been shut down, resulting in many studios losing large amounts of money. In an article by Euronews.com, it states, "The trouble with the pandemic, according to L'Amour, is some people may be less likely to watch new films at the cinema despite stringent stay-at-home measures beginning to lift." This was something widely reported in the days before some of Europe's lockdowns and showed plummeting earnings at the box office were due to a feeling of reluctance from cinema goers. This has led some studios to change the way in which they release movies, choosing to skip theatrical releases and distribute films directly to streaming services. However, this decision has been met with some pushback from cinemas and others within the industry. In the same article by Euronews, it goes on to state, "But some studios have taken a different track. Universal's Trolls World Tour was released on digital rental platforms earlier this month, and made nearly $100 million in its first 3 weeks, a figure higher than the original Trolls movie made in 5 months of showing in the cinema, according to the Wall Street Journal. Another massive aspect of this is while studios and cinemas are losing money, streaming services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and even Disney Plus are experiencing significant increase in their businesses as a result of the pandemic. This increase in business will allow the services to grow and continue their attempts at gaining dominance over the other services, as the impact of the streaming service was already affecting the industry even before the pandemic. In an article by IndieWire.com, it's all but assured we'll see even more eye-popping deals as companies battle for subscribers' dollars and embrace the prospects of operating streaming platforms as a loss in order to make that happen. But as streaming continues to grow in importance compared to theatrical releases, there will eventually need to be a method to the madness. Netflix is already thinking about how it can mirror blockbuster theatrical paydays by offering bonuses for films that win awards or pull in large number of viewers, a move that could help set the standard for how talent is compensated in this new era. This will also add to the issue of the shakeup that's been happening to distribution. As studios are able to send movies directly to audiences, this would eventually lead to smaller distribution companies losing money as they are no longer needed. In an article by ScreenDaily.com, it states, "This has seen a disappearance of the traditional middle, with the larger independent companies struggling to make enough money to cover their significant overheads. Icon Film Distribution permanently closed at the beginning of 2018, with its library sold to Kaleidoscope." Alex Hamilton, the long-standing president of International Film E1, is leaving the company in March 2019, signaling a shift by the company away from single-picture acquisitions and distribution to a greater focus on development and production. Even in the light of the pandemic, there are other issues that still face the film industry that it will need to deal with once the pandemic is over. One key issue that the industry has struggled to deal with is inclusivity challenges. According to the same article by the IndieWire, a USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative report released in the fall put it simply: inclusion in Hollywood continues to proceed at a very slow pace and inconsistently. The fact that played out most recent in the 2020 BAFTA nominations, which saw only white actors and male directors. While there are examples of more diverse directors and filmmakers making strides in the industry, there are still issues facing filmmakers who are trying to find more recognition within the industry. However, there have been significant changes within recent years, with films like the South Korean film Parasite winning Best Pictures at the Oscars. As the film industry has grown from its infancy and managed to spread throughout the world, it is in a state of constantly evolving due to the influences of other countries and individuals adding their own filmmaking techniques and styles, which are still being expanded upon and developed. And while the film industry continues to face many issues as it develops, it is an industry that has proven to be extremely adaptable and has made significant changes in the past to respond to issues that have faced it before, and now will only be a matter of time before more changes to the industry. And while the film industry continues to face many issues as it develops, it is an industry that has proven to be extremely adaptable and has made significant changes in the past to respond to issues that have faced it before, and now it will only be a matter of time before more changes come to the industry in response to the issues that it is currently facing, so that filmmakers can continue to create and share unique films with wide audiences. Thank you for watching the video and looking into the film industry. If you would like to find more information for yourself, you can please visit these websites, which were always sourced throughout the video. Once again, I thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed this look into the film industry. Goodbye for now.